Thebes, Greece, autumn of 335 BC. The city is burning. Not a foreign city, not a barbarian stronghold on the edge of the known world. A Greek city. One of the oldest and most celebrated in the Hellenic world. A city that produced Pindar, that defeated Sparta at Leuctra, that had stood for centuries as a pillar of the civilization Alexander claimed to represent. It is burning because a 21-year-old king decided it should burn. 6,000 Thebans are dead in the streets. The Macedonian army has swept through the city with a violence calibrated not to defeat, but to erase. The garrison fought, the garrison lost. What followed was not the aftermath of a battle, it was the execution of a policy. Alexander had ordered the destruction of Thebes as a message, not to Thebes, which would cease to exist by nightfall, to every other Greek city that might consider the possibility that a 21-year-old boy who had just inherited his murdered father's throne could be defied. 30,000 people are being herded into holding areas outside the walls. Women, children, the elderly, the population that remained after the men of fighting age had been killed in the streets. They are standing in open ground surrounded by Macedonian soldiers, waiting for a process they understand because slavery is not an abstraction in the Greek world. It is an institution. They know what comes next. The sorting, the evaluation, the markets. In a house in the upper quarter of the city, a woman named Timoclea is standing over a well in her courtyard. Minutes earlier, a Thracian cavalry officer serving under Alexander had broken into her home. He had assaulted her. When he was finished, still breathing heavily, he demanded to know where she kept her valuables. Gold, silver, whatever a noble woman of Thebes would possess. Timoclea told him she had thrown everything into the well when the city fell. The officer leaned over the edge to look. Timoclea placed both hands on his back and pushed. He fell. When he hit the bottom, she dropped stones on him until the sounds he was making stopped. She was arrested by soldiers who found her standing beside the well. She was brought before Alexander in chains. He asked who she was. She told him she was the sister of Theagenes, the general who had fought Alexander's father Philip at the Battle of Chaeronea. She said it without apology, without fear, or at least without the kind of fear that shows. Alexander, who admired defiance when it came in a form he found aesthetically pleasing, released her. He let her go. She walked free. This story appears in every biography of Alexander the Great. Plutarch tells it. Diodorus tells it. It is presented as evidence of Alexander's magnanimity, his respect for courage, his noble character. A great man recognizing greatness in a woman who had just killed one of his soldiers. The story is true. It is also a curtain. Because behind Timoclea, behind the dramatic scene that the ancient historians preserve because it flattered the man they were writing about, stood 30,000 women and children who did not push their attackers into wells, who did not have wells, who did not get an audience with the king, who stood in the holding areas outside the burning city and waited to be sold. Their story is not in Plutarch. It is not in the biographies that shaped how the Western world learned about Alexander for 23 centuries. Their story is the one this video tells. Alexander the Great. The name itself is a conclusion disguised as an introduction. Great. The word has been attached to him for 23 centuries, applied so automatically that it functions less as a judgment than as a label. Alexander the Great, the way you say Julius Caesar or Genghis Khan. A name that has absorbed its adjective until the two are inseparable, and the question of whether the adjective is deserved has been buried beneath the weight of repetition. You learned about him in school. The student of Aristotle, the military genius who never lost a battle, the young king who conquered the Persian Empire, reached India, and wept because there were no more worlds to conquer. The statues with the perfect hair swept back from the forehead and the gaze tilted upward toward a horizon that only he could see. The man who spread Greek civilization across the known world and created the Hellenistic age that shaped Western culture for centuries. That version is not false. It is incomplete in a way that functions as a lie. The ancient sources that constructed Alexander's image were written by men who admired him. Arrian, a Greek historian writing 4 centuries after Alexander's death, based his account on the memoirs of Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals, a man with every reason to present his former commander in the best possible light. Plutarch wrote a biography that was explicitly a study in moral character, selecting episodes that illustrated virtues and minimizing those that did not. Diodorus and Curtius provided more critical accounts, but still operated within a tradition that treated Alexander as a figure of admiration whose excesses were regrettable departures from an otherwise noble character. The language these historians used when describing the destruction of cities tells you everything about whose perspective shaped the narrative. The city was taken. The inhabitants were sold. Passive constructions that distance the reader from the actor and the action. A city does not take itself. Inhabitants do not sell themselves. Alexander took the city. Alexander's soldiers seized the inhabitants. Alexander's officers organized the auctions where women and children stood on platforms while buyers assessed their teeth and their muscle tone and their age and decided what price to offer for a human being. If you want to understand what those passive sentences concealed, what actually happened to the women of every city Alexander destroyed, what the phrase sold into slavery meant in practice for tens of thousands of women across 13 years of continuous conquest, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button, because what I am about to reveal is the story that 23 centuries of admiration was specifically constructed to prevent you from hearing. Stay to the end, because the final chapter of Alexander's campaign involved a decision that killed thousands of women and children for no strategic reason at all. And his historians recorded it with the same reverent tone they applied to his greatest victories. The destruction of Thebes needs to be understood in full because it established the template that Alexander would apply across a continent for the next 13 years. Everything that happened at Tyre and Persepolis, and a dozen cities between them, began at Thebes. The pattern was set here. The precedent was established. And the women of Thebes were the first to learn what it meant to be on the receiving end of Alexander's policy. Thebes had revolted. That is the justification the ancient sources provide, and the one that every subsequent historian has accepted as sufficient context. Philip, Alexander's father, had been assassinated in 336 BC. Alexander was 20 years old. The Greek cities, which had been forced into submission by Philip's military dominance, saw the succession of an untested young king as an opportunity to reclaim their independence. Thebes led the revolt, besieging the Macedonian garrison that Philip had installed in the city's citadel. Alexander moved south with a speed that the ancient sources describe with admiration and that the Thebans experienced as catastrophe. He covered the distance from Macedonia to Thebes in less than 2 weeks. The city had expected negotiations. It got a siege. The siege lasted days rather than weeks. When the walls were breached and the garrison relieved, Alexander issued the order that transformed a military victory into an act of annihilation. Kill the men, enslave the women and children, raze the city to the ground, spare only the temples and the house of Pindar, the poet whose work Alexander admired. Culture was to be preserved. People were not. Diodorus records 6,000 killed in the fighting and its immediate aftermath, 30,000 enslaved. The numbers are large enough that the mind resists processing them as individual human experiences, which is exactly how the ancient historians intended them to function. A number is an abstraction. 30,000 is a statistic. But 30,000 means 30,000 individual moments of capture. 30,000 women and children pulled from homes, from hiding places, from the arms of people trying to protect them. 30,000 separations, mothers from children, sisters from brothers, wives from the bodies of husbands lying in the streets. The enslaved were sorted in the holding areas outside the city. This was standard procedure in Greek warfare. The sorting followed categories that the slave markets required: age, sex, physical condition.